Okay, so this week, when we're dealing with our final exam, I decided to do something different this year, and that is I'm going to give you all an opportunity to do a case study of your choosing. Provide some details on the course website this week. But basically, I thought, there's one part of the law that I haven't really discussed in this class in the past, and that is with regard to utilities. Um, I'm also going to use the Golden Pacific Power Link and specifically talk a little bit more about its implications passing through the city of Temecula as a case study. Now, we all know that utilities place a certain amount of risk on the landscape, and that historically, we also recognize that there have been some fairly serious incidents in California and nationally and internationally as well related to utilities infrastructure. Um, we've talked about some of the risks and liability that falls onto different parties when an incident occurs or when it's started by them or their equipment or negligence or whatever it happens to be, right? That law has been dramatically revised over the years. It used to be that it didn't matter where or how a utility company may have been involved in a fire. All of the liability fell on them in almost its entirety for the most part. And it was presumed, much like with a lot of our big federal laws, it was presumed that if the utility was involved, then they bear all of the risk. And that included the financial risk that may be attributed to it as well. But the question really has to do with when a project is justified as essential by the state of California. And by essential, I mean that it's part of regional or statewide infrastructure as described and needed according to the California Public Utilities Commission and the California Independent System Operator, or CAISO. How should the law account for risks concentrated in one community and one cultural landscape? So let's talk a little bit about what it means to be a utility in California. Not all of this will apply to every other state, so we're just focused mostly on California today. Now, the objectives here are to identify how electrical infrastructure can create, amplify, or complicate wildfire risk. I think we've talked, a bit about that already, but and hopefully you all sort of recognize what that is inherently. You also should be able to describe overlapping authority of the CAISO, California Public Utilities Commission, energy safety, CEQA, NEPA, tribal consultations, and so forth. A lot of moving parts when it comes to utilities. And then being able to understand fire access, evacuation, watershed, biological, cultural resource impacts, these connected systems, right? There's a lot of um, connectivity that occurs in this. Um, And then apply this concept and substantial evidence framework to a proposed transmission corridor and its alternatives, right? And this is kind of what we'll be talking about today with regard to the Golden Pacific Power Link. Now, I'm not asking you to take a for or against position on anything, because, and you can if you want to in your final exam. But really, what we're trying to do is understand um, the objectives here of providing utilities and what that means on the landscape and what that means from a fire risk perspective. Now, there can be all sorts of institutions involved with this. The CAISO or CAISO, depending on who you're talking to, they select transmission solutions and establish grid planning and the rationale for grid planning, right? So they're sort of the big dog in sort of establishing what we need for the state of California. All of this is overseen by, and the need for energy is overseen by the California Energy Commission and the California Public Utility Commission jointly. Um, the CPUC typically acts as the lead agency for CEQA and decides what's called the CPEN here in the citing piece of it. It's basically public necessity acknowledgement, right? So what we're talking about is going through sort of this whole process of trying to understand what the impacts are. And what they've done with the Golden Pacific Power Link now is they've identified the energy need, they've put the grid planning and everything else together, and they said we need a connection, right? Local governments, counties, cities, or any other affected jurisdictions do not control CPUC transmission siting. Local plans, emergency conditions, technical evidence, community impacts are part of the review and the record that's put together on the decision making, but there is no actual authority given to local governments. This is strictly held at the state level. Oops. Okay, so this is what's being proposed, and this all started out many years ago. And San Onofre nuclear power plant. So up in the left corner here, this is Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. You move into Orange County up here. San Onofre nuclear power plant, or SONGS, sits right in this area here as well. The power plant was shut down years ago, a move away from nuclear energy in this part of California. And it was a well over 2,000 megawatt power plant supplying the region. And so that loss left a big hole in supply. Now, my understanding is we've kind of filled that with different, solar and wind and all the other projects that have gone on. But there's still this idea that there is a lot of energy being produced, okay, in Imperial Valley down here, and that energy is not being used in Imperial Valley. There's just not enough people and not enough use. They could transmit that electricity into Arizona, but Arizona seems to have enough power. Really, the idea was you build a lot of electric projects out in the valley here in Imperial, and somewhere needs to be distributed all of that energy. And my understanding is only a fraction of what's being produced now is actually being used. And so there's a lot of abandoned energy that's waiting to get to somewhere. And so the CPUC and ultimately the Cal ISO decided that we need to get from point A to point B, point A down here to point B up here. And the idea then is to distribute that energy largely, I would assume, to Orange County and Los Angeles counties where the need is the greatest. Now, what they're looking at, though, is basically, how do you connect point A and point B? And so there's a bid that went out uh, months ago, over a year ago now, I think, and four companies bid on it. One of those included San Diego Gas and Electric. And they put together their design or their preliminaries on what they think the connection between A and B should look like. Then the state of California, through Cal ISO, looks at all of those bids and makes a determination of which one they think should be the winning bid, and they awarded that. Now, interestingly enough, this is the winning bid, and this sort of vague dotted line connecting A to B here is what was ultimately proposed. Now, this is not SDG&E's winning bid. They are the ones building the project, but the winning bid was actually submitted by a different company. That company only wants to build the substations at north of Songs and Imperial Valley. They don't want to build all the infrastructure in between. So SDG&E was given the opportunity to take over that portion of the project. But again, it wasn't their original design. This is one that they had adopted. So, one of the important take homes here is that this may look very similar to what it is in the end, or it may look nothing like this, right? And this is where review and environmental process and the public process comes into play. So the interesting thing, though, is that they've proposed this through the city of Temecula. Now, the project, the winning bid, was the only bid out of the four that actually passed outside of San Diego County into Riverside County and went through the city of Temecula. All three other bids, including SDG&E's own original bid, did not include that alignment. So the other interesting thing is when you look down through the valley of where they could possibly site large scale infrastructure, there's only one place. And the line kind of going back to this map, the line kind of when you zoom in, it kind of follows where we thought it was going to be. It's being proposed in Temecula Creek, which ultimately goes into Santa Margarita River and up over the mountain. And kind of confusingly, whether it's in the Santa Margarita Ecological Reserve or not, to be determined. But ultimately dumps into Orange County with a little bit of overlap into federal land with Camp Pendleton. So, absent SDG&E's original project, this is what we're left with. Now, going back to this slide here, uh, we know power lines produce risk for wildfires. Ignitions, they're in heavy fuels sometimes, and there's a responsibility to suppress that. There's also the other issue of mobility. So when you put in this electrical infrastructure, you still need access to areas. You still need to be able to evacuate communities. You still have worries about congestion and other things as well. And moving, fire equipment into an incident and people out of that incident. Now, I don't see a whole lot of projects in California anymore ever proposing to do any major construction inside of a riparian area or riverbed. And that's exactly what Temecula Creek is. No, it doesn't flow year round, but it is still a riparian area. And typically, those are kind of hands off when it comes to major construction and projects. So everybody was a little bit surprised to see that that was where the proposed alignment was. A little bit of background on this area. You should know that this isn't the first time a project has been proposed by SDG&E to go and install large-scale power lines. This was done in about 2001, and it was pulled pretty quickly because there was massive community opposition, along with the Pachanga tribe as well. So this whole concept then is kind of weird to everybody in the valley because there have been a number of big projects like former utility lines that have failed, like the Liberty Quarry project that was proposed up the hill, kind of in the same sort of area that failed. And the reason it failed is because, there is the Temecula Creek flows into the Santa Margarita River. That is the last fully protected free-flowing river in all of Southern California. The corridor that they're proposing to build in is also the Santa Ana Palomar Mountains habitat wildlife linkage. It is the last inland to coastal habitat wildlife linkage left in Southern California as well. Goes from the coast all the way to, the inland through the Palomar Mountains. Along that pathway, there are a number of endangered plants, endangered species. The habitat is considered sensitive throughout. And so you run into all of these additional conflicts. Layer on top of that, not only that it's a riparian area, but it's also considered extremely sensitive cultural property for Luiseño tribes, and in particular Pachanga. It's called a traditional cultural property or a TCP. And that is a landscape sort of level, not just a unique one, sort of cultural resource on the ground. It is a landscape level. And where they're proposing to put the power line through is directly in the middle of what's considered their creation story, which was a big reason why the proposed Liberty Quarry from years ago was ultimately rejected. So here we are in this place where we have all of these sort of massive constraints, and you would be hard pressed to find kind of a more sensitive area in Southern California. But layer on top of that one other additional piece, which is the city of Temecula has done its due diligence in identifying its highest risk fire prone areas. And exactly where this power line is running through is considered the highest fire risk to the community. And so you're placing electrical infrastructure in the highest wildfire risk area, where currently the city has completed its first community wildfire protection plan and is spending a lot of money and resources and time trying to reduce that risk through fuels reduction programs, vegetation clearing, and other mitigation measures. So there's three distinct pathways on which we worry about wildfires and utilities. Um, The infrastructure proposed here is a 500 kV line, 500 kilovolts. It is the largest transmission line possible or being built in California right now. Um, Ignition happens through equipment failure, vegetation contact, construction activity. There have been those Mylar balloons and other things that have blown into the infrastructure and caused fires, line slap when the winds. 500 kV lines, and this happened not too long ago in Edison's territory north of us, a little ways, where the utility towers under higher winds basically fell over entirely, started some fires and so forth. So ignition is a real risk. Propagation. So when you have fires, especially in high risk areas, they can move quickly. And one of the issues here is that this is kind of a wind corridor. It has a lot of fuels. And there is a bit of a suppression delay when you place large utilities in the middle of all of that. You can't place aircraft like you normally would. You can't put firefighters under high voltage power lines like you normally would be able to drop them on the landscape. There's a lot of issues. And then finally, there's this sort of consequence to all of that, which is an evacuation conflict, energized equipment, and community exposure. So all of that said, how do we feel about this project? Well, not surprising. A lot of folks have decided to oppose this, including the city of Temecula, the county of Riverside, the school district, both the assembly member and senator for that district, and many of the surrounding cities, now into San Diego. Don't forget, this project doesn't just affect Temecula; it goes all the way between Imperial and basically Orange County. So there's a lot of properties along that pathway that are very concerned, including Anza Borrego State Park. So California regulates utilities and wildfire safety, but a plan is not how do I say this, is not route approval, right? So this route hasn't been approved. It's going to go through a fairly rigorous process. And the whole point of all of this is to come up with, an appropriate project. If we absolutely need to get power from A to B, how do we do that in the best way possible? Um, One of the things that you also need to provide through the CEQA process that we've already talked about is wildfire mitigation. Utility-wide risks. It's reviewed by the Office of Energy Infrastructure, and the CPUC ratifies and approves these plans. One of the unique things about all of this is the CPUC is the ultimate deciding entity. And unlike most large public projects, there's no traditional public hearing. That public hearing is actually in San Francisco, and it's more of a quasi-judicial process with five members appointed by the governor's office who sit on this board for the California Public Utilities Commission, ultimately making the decision yes or no. It doesn't allow for a lot of public input and public comment or protest hearings or anything else. It's very much a different process than you would normally see if this were a project run by a city or a county. So we go through all of this environmental review, and we've talked a bit about that when we talked about CEQA and NEPA. And this project is going to have to do both because, first, the project is a state project in the state of California, but second, it goes through federal property, including Bureau of Land Management. And that will require activation of a NEPA review as well. So where are we in this process, right? The formal application is expected at the end of this year. The current stage is pre-filing application. The other piece here, when I talked about the CPCN application, what that means up here is Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity. So there has to be a finding that this project is needed by the state of California. And then there's the scoping and environmental review that occurs. Hearings and the record is formed. And then there's a decision and any conditions that they want to place on the project. But you should be asking yourselves, what becomes part of the administrative record when and through what procedural vehicle? Because again, this isn't a traditional project under CEQA. It's a little bit different. And so all along this way, you would think that there are opportunities for public comment, but in fact, there really aren't. During the CEQA review, scoping and environmental review, there definitely are, but I don't know whether they're going to have any large hearings or anything like that. Um, but I will say that the interesting part about this is that because it's in San Francisco, because it's held by the CPUC, the process, like I said, is more quasi-judicial. It seems more like a courtroom than a public hearing. And because of that, it's very difficult to be a participant in the process. Unlike if you were just a neighbor, and the city was proposing a housing development or a new road or something, you can go to the public hearing and make your comments and have your voice heard, send in letters and all that. In this case, what has to happen is you have to become in what's called an intervener, and you have to file official paperwork with the state asking to have intervener status, which basically makes you a party to the case in essence. City of Temecula is in the process of doing that. I'm sure the tribe is as well. There are a lot of other folks included in this, and as well as a group called Save Temecula, which is a nonprofit that has formed in opposition of this project. So, going back to CEQA, CEQA asks whether infrastructure may exacerbate wildfire risk. Now, it's going to ask a whole lot of other questions: cultural resources, biological resources, aesthetics, view, all sorts of other stuff gets included. But, because of the content of this class, we're going to focus largely on the wildfire risk. And so the questions really are several fold. One is, does it impair an adopted emergency response or evacuation plan? Does it expose people or structures to wildfire pollutants or uncontrolled spread? Can it exacerbate risk through slope, winds, fuel, or project features? And does it create post-fire flooding, landslide, or slope into stability risk, right? Those are a handful of the questions that are going to have to be asked through the CEQA process. Um, the process, however, it's kind of interesting because you have to provide evidence if you're going to say, that a new alignment or a new transmission route needs to be identified. You can't just say not here, right? You have to not only identify the risks and the uncertainty and the potential problems with it, but you also have to be able to provide alternatives as well. Makes this a very challenging case to proceed with. Talking about evacuation, evacuation is a network capacity problem, not a promise to coordinate. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you have outbound and inbound, right? And what we're really talking about is under certain fire weather conditions, and if there was, God forbid, an actual incident, how do you get people effectively out of the area and get resources and equipment effectively into the area? Now, I'm proud to say that Temecula has just recently completed its evacuation planning for the city, and we have multiple zones throughout the city to be able to develop our own evacuation plans as needed, not just for fire, but for any kind of incident. But the analysis that's required, not just by us, but by SDG&E in this proposed project has to do with choke points, capacity, contraflow, disabled vehicles, smoke visibility, gate control, loss of power and communications, all of those things that can happen when people are moving in and out of a high risk evacuated area. Now, firefighter access is one of the other big concerns on this. It can be degraded before a line even ignites fire. You have lane closures, you have heavy equipment, you have narrow approaches, the footprint of the towers, energized line setbacks, aerial constraints for air resources. And then there's the whole coordination piece with the utilities, right? Being able to de-energize and re-energize and re-enter areas is very dangerous. And also, one of the things a lot of folks don't recognize is when we do de-energize our lines, where do you think the power goes, right? Like some of it'll trickle off of those lines into the existing users, but when you turn it off, you miss something very important in the calculus of electricity, and that is the mechanical energy to continue moving electricity forward, right? Across a line from point A to point B. So when you de-energize, believe it or not, the electricity just kind of sits there. And so just because lines are de-energized does not mean they have electricity sitting in those lines, and they can still continue to be very dangerous for a very long period of time. And then, of course, there's the risk of exposures, right? Not just the smoke exposure that comes, not just from delayed initial attack and a fire, growing larger than it may, but the electrical hazards that go along with that too, and the equipment that's associated with it catching on fire. So the standard question isn't just can firefighters reach it, but can they operate effectively under foreseeable incident conditions? Now, pivoting here a bit, we talked a little bit about biological resources, sensitive habitats, ecosystems, watershed, and so forth. But cultural resources are kind of a unique piece. AB 52 was passed a few years ago, and what it requires today is it requires consultation with California Native American tribes and the identification and treatment of tribal cultural resources under CEQA. All right. So prior to this, it was all sort of recommended that you coordinate with the tribes, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of times projects move forward without really effectively doing a consultation. Now it's required by law. And that really was a game changer for the tribes to have proper representation because oftentimes people look at the tribe and say, well, you're on a reservation. That's where your cultural resources are. And the reality is, like with Pachanga, that is not where their village was historically. That is not where their peoples lived. They were moved out of Temecula and out of areas. Actually, the one of the last slaughters of um, tribes in North America actually happened in the city of Temecula. And there was a massacre that occurred, and then they were moved by gunpoint to the reservation they are at today. Um, so under CEQA, it requires consultation. Under NEPA, it's a little bit different. Where federal action is involved, agencies must consider effects on historic properties and consult tribes, government to government. So there's still that requirement there. It is still an explicit requirement. But there's a critical distinction here that you should note. A living cultural landscape may be harmed without disturbing a single artifact on the ground, right? And visibility, setting, spiritual association, access, water, sound, landscape integrity can all be culturally significant, even where tower foundations avoid actual mapped sites of, say, a burial or, a sensitive cultural resource that, rock art or something like that. The creek alignment converts construction impacts into watershed questions. And I think this is one of the more interesting ones. You're building in a creek bed, which is really not a common activity. The main reason we ever build in a creek bed is what? Usually to put in a bridge, right? And you'll see the big footings and other infrastructure, but it is not multiple sites along an entire pathway. Um, so how do they expect to put in infrastructure in a riverbed and also have to navigate all the state and federal laws associated with this? This is a huge lift for them. And then working with the Clean Water Act, Section 404 and 401 basically state you can't dredge or fill bodies of water in the United States. There's a state stream bed alteration agreement and water quality authorities that all have to be involved. There's an existing watershed management plan that actually I'd helped write many years ago for the Santa Margarita River watershed. And again, protected species and habitats. And this area overlays the Habitat Conservation Plan for Western Riverside County as well. So there are other places where you can put the line. You don't have to put it through here. And if it's determined by the state of California that getting electricity from point A to point B is absolutely necessary, then, how do we deal with this? Well, one of the things you can always propose, and NEPA has this as we discussed, is a no project alternative. But according to the state of California, that's not an alternative, right? They need the project, is what they're saying right now. So, can the corridor avoid Temecula Creek and sensitive communities? Is there a route left? And this is where it gets really complicated in California. California, has 40 some odd million people today. A lot of development, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of sensitive habitat, a lot of cultural resources, watersheds, air quality impacts, all of these things that we concern ourselves with when we talk about the environment. It's getting harder and harder to do large scale projects like what's proposed here. So, if not here, then where? You have to put it somewhere if that's the state's determination. What about undergrounding? It's technically feasible, but it's extremely expensive and extremely difficult to underground, especially 500 kV lines, because there's a lot of heat associated with it, and you can't let that underground storage heat up too much. So you have to provide cooling and you have to provide access and all sorts of other constraints. And then the question is, well, if Temecula Creek's the only option on where to route this, could you imagine undergrounding 500 kV lines and the massive trenching that would need to occur throughout the entire riparian corridor? Now it's even more of an impact. And is that something that we're okay to deal with? Now, one of the other pieces of the puzzle is the technology today, right? We have reconductoring available, which says you could basically take existing power lines, maybe a 230 line, and upgrade it to a 500 kV line. There's battery storage, there's distributed resources, there's microgrids, there's phased upgrades. In a lot of respects, one of the things that's been said is that large scale infrastructure projects like the one being proposed um, is a dinosaur the day it's built. Energy is moving in a very different direction today, and large scale distributed energy projects like this one um, start to seem old fashioned, antique, if you will. CEQA does require a reasonable range of sort of avoiding or substantially lessening significant impacts. Not every imaginable option, but reasonable options. But again, who's responsible for proposing those? Is it SDG&E? Is it the, project proponents? Is it the cities and counties and neighbors and everybody else? The answer is it's kind of all of the above. Mitigation must change the outcome and be enforceable, right? It has to be specific, measurable, legally enforceable, tied to a threshold, monitored over time. And this is where CEQA is actually kind of weak. NEPA requires stronger mitigation and monitoring programs. CEQA does not require that same thing. And so projects get built, and then a lot of the mitigation measures and things either don't occur or, long-term planning and long-term mitigation measures often either fail or are not maintained properly. So this is definitely something that needs to be considered. The administrative record rewards specificity. Again, anybody coming to SDG&E or the CPUC and saying, not in my backyard, is not a winning argument. Everybody's going to say that because nobody wants this. Just for scale, you have to realize that what they're proposing is about 20 stories tall or roughly 200 feet in the air. And it's actually taller than that because if they have to put it in the creek bed itself, then they have to put it on a footing that's large enough to be outside of the, I think, 50-year floodplain, which is substantially high. So, you're talking, well over 200 feet of towers traversing through a community where none of that currently exists. So, um, we have to be careful between the difference between advocacy and the law, and comments that have meaning and those that don't. If you bring in information on where alternatives are, or where sensitive resources are, or where modeling has shown significant fire risk, that's tangible to the record. Um, Evidence like maps, data, expert analysis, that's all tangible as well, and can go on the record. And then if you have anything statistically significant thresholds or consequences or models or predictions, all of that's allowed as well. And then the remedy itself, what are the alternatives or what are the mitigation? Those are all fair game for the administrative record. And again, the more qualified, the more direct, the more, um, I think, evidence-based that this all is, the more traction it gets in these processes. Now, if we're going to do something like this, let's think about this as sort of a case exercise. We're looking at a project. We have to build an argument from facts, not conclusions, right? We're not making conclusions. We're just saying, here's the facts and allowing decision makers to see everything on the table. That's what CEQA and NEPA are, right? Environmental review generally is just a disclosure document, and I think I may have mentioned this in the last lecture. It's like when you buy a home and you have your inspection done. It tells you where all the termites are and all the leaky pipes and electrical failures and broken foundations and cracked roof tiles or whatever it is, right? And then you get to make a decision. Do I want to buy that home or don't I? And you get to tell that property owner, you say, well, I'll buy the property, but you need to fix the foundation and the leaky pipes. I'll deal with the rest myself, right? And then eventually a decision is made. But the whole point is disclosure, transparency, information to be able to make a decision. So, in order to go through this process, we need to be able to provide facts. SDG&E and CAISO, they need reliability, they need cost. There is a need for the electricity, and there has to be feasibility in the project. The project has to be able to be built, right? Cities and fire issues, its access, its evacuation, its public safety. It can go farther. It can talk about things like aesthetics as well. The tribe, of course, has their concerns about cultural landscape, sovereignty, consultation, cultural resources. And the reviewing agency, the CPUC, will look at all of this stuff in terms of adequacy, alternatives, and findings. And they're going to have to make a decision about where this thing needs to happen or whether it happens at all. And it's kind of a predetermined, sort of conclusion in a lot of respects, right? Because the state has already said we need to get power from point A to point B. So something has to happen. The core legal question, therefore, is not whether transmission is needed. We've answered that question. It's a futile argument to make at this point. It's whether the project in this place has been justified after a lawful comparison. That's the way the law reads when you go through this process. Has the need been defined transparently? Were all the cards put on the table and a fair evaluation of what the hazards, the risks, the costs, and the benefits are? Were route-specific risk analyses analyzed under credible extreme case scenarios? Because that's what we get now, right? These aren't just normal fires we have anymore in California. They are extreme events. Did consultation shape the project or merely document objections? Right? When you talk to the tribe, and this is a very common thing in CEQA, when you talk to the tribe, did it change anything measurably? They shared all of these sort of concerns. They're real concerns. They documented, they provide you maps, they provide you, information, expert opinions, science, facts, all of this kind of stuff. Did it measurably change any of your outcomes? Did you actively consider that, and did it have an impact on your decision making? Were less damaging alternatives compared on equal terms? Or are they just predisposed to this is the preferred route, this is what was selected during the bidding process, and we're just going to go ahead and do this? Alternatives kind of become a secondary analysis just to check the box off legally. And again, that's something that happens quite frequently. Are residual risks disclosed, mitigated, and supported by the findings as well? So, infrastructure is never just a line on the map, right? In the wildland urban interface, routing is a risk allocation. There is risk along the entire route. The job of law, in this case, is to make the allocation visible, evidence-based, consultative, and accountable. Think about this. What would a defensible record need to show? Right? That's what the law is trying to get at in this case. So, for this week's discussion, I'm going to have you look at, this project, and let's talk about this in terms of just a single tower site sits beside Temecula Creek near a constrained roadway in a culturally sensitive landscape. Assume the tower itself occupies a relatively small footprint. Construction requires temporary access roads and vegetation removal. SDG&E proposes standard fire prevention measures. Location avoids a recorded archaeological object. No corridor-specific evacuation model had been completed. Can the agency conclude that impacts are less than significant? What evidence or analysis is missing with all of the assumptions that I'm providing you? That's going to be placed on the course website for this week, and I want you to think critically about it and provide some good discussion. So, the final exam is going to be a little bit different, like I mentioned. It's going to allow you to focus all of your efforts on answering a handful of questions related to a utility project, a transmission line, or a fire or incident related to transmission lines in the state of California. A lot more details provided online. Look forward to kind of a unique way of doing the final exam and getting you guys to kind of take in a lot of the information we've used so far this semester and help answer that question. And I'm going to give you plenty of time to be able to do that. Thank you all for joining me for this lecture.